Most people believe empaths leave because they turn cold. That belief is wrong. Empaths rarely turn cold. They simply reach a point where silence becomes safer than explanation. Empaths stay through disappointment. They stay through mistakes. They stay through emotional storms that would push others away instantly. Their loyalty runs deeper than words can explain. But there exists a line, quiet and invisible, that slowly shifts everything. It is not crossed in a single moment. It is crossed through repetition, through patterns, through emotional neglect that becomes familiar. Trust remains visible on the surface, yet internal alignment begins to fade without notice. And once that line is crossed, something inside an empath changes. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, almost invisibly. The warmth remains, but access to it begins to close. Their energy starts turning inward, away from constant emotional exposure. Most people never notice the shift until it becomes irreversible. The empath is still present, still kind, still understanding, yet already stepping away on the inside. The connection weakens long before distance appears in the physical world, because departure for an empath never begins with walking away. It begins with detachment, a slow withdrawal from emotional investment, a gradual return to self, piece by piece without announcement or conflict. By the time physical distance arrives, the decision is already settled within their inner world. The goodbye becomes only the final echo of a choice made long before, in silence and emotional exhaustion. This video reveals the hidden breaking points that push empaths beyond their limits, the silent signs that appear before emotional disappearance, and the truth behind why their absence often feels sudden even when it was building for a long time beneath the surface. Stay until the end, because understanding this pattern can change how relationships are seen, how love is protected, and how emotional boundaries are respected. Welcome to Empath Energy, and subscribe to Empath Energy for more deep emotional insights that reveal the unseen layers of human connection. Something subtle separates empaths from everyone else in relationships. It is not loud. It is not obvious. It is a quiet strength that often becomes their greatest vulnerability. Empaths see more than behavior. They see meaning behind it. Where others see distance, they see pain. Where others see anger, they see unspoken hurt. Where others see confusion, they sense history. This deeper perception changes everything. Because while many people respond to actions on the surface, empaths respond to the story underneath those actions. They start asking why instead of reacting to what is happening in the moment. That shift makes them stay longer than almost anyone else. Even when things feel difficult, they keep searching for understanding. Even when communication becomes inconsistent, they try to interpret silence instead of leaving it. Even when emotional effort is one-sided, they convince themselves that patience will reveal a deeper truth. To them, people are not just their mistakes. People are their wounds, their past, their unfinished healing. And once that belief forms, walking away starts feeling like giving up on someone instead of protecting themselves. So while others leave at the first sign of emotional imbalance, empaths stay. They stay through confusion. They stay through emotional distance. They stay through moments that slowly drain them without immediate awareness. Not because they enjoy pain, not because they cannot see reality, but because their mind keeps translating struggle into potential. Every difficult moment becomes something to understand rather than something to escape. Over time, this creates a pattern that is hard to break. The more they understand, the more they tolerate. The more they tolerate, the longer they remain. And the longer they remain, the harder it becomes to recognize when staying is no longer aligned with their own emotional well-being. And somewhere inside that cycle, boundaries begin to blur in ways that are almost impossible to notice at first. It rarely begins with acceptance of bad behavior. It begins with interpretation, a quiet rewriting of reality that feels compassionate in the moment, but slowly reshapes what is considered normal. Empaths start explaining what others would immediately question. A sharp tone becomes stress. A distant reply becomes emotional overload. A broken promise becomes understandable because life feels heavy for everyone. They're stressed. They didn't mean it. They've been through a lot. Each explanation softens the impact of behavior that should have created distance. Instead of creating boundaries, these thoughts create patience. Instead of creating clarity, they create tolerance. And with every excuse, something important shifts. The emotional standard quietly lowers. What once felt unacceptable slowly becomes manageable. What once felt painful starts feeling familiar, and what once demanded respect begins to receive understanding instead. Empaths do not realize how this pattern develops. They believe they are being fair. They believe they are seeing the full picture, and in many cases they are. But seeing context does not always mean accepting impact. Second chances come naturally to them, because they believe people grow through understanding, not rejection. Then second chances turn into third chances. Then third chances turn into repeated cycles that no longer feel like isolated moments, but like patterns that repeat with different excuses attached each time. And still, the empath stays, not because they are unaware of the behavior, but because their focus remains on what the person could become instead of what is consistently being shown. Over time, forgiveness stops being an occasional choice and becomes a reflex, a default response to emotional disruption, a way to restore peace without addressing the deeper imbalance forming beneath it. And within that repeated cycle of understanding and patience, something quiet begins to develop, a tolerance for things that slowly reshape emotional boundaries without ever announcing their presence. At the beginning, everything feels manageable. Nothing feels severe enough to question the connection. Just small moments that don't fully align but are easy to explain away in the moment. A delayed reply, a shifted tone, a promise that fades without acknowledgement. Subtle signs that something is off, yet not strong enough to demand action right away. Empaths notice these things, they always do, but instead of treating them as warnings, they process them through understanding, through context, through emotional interpretation that leans toward hope rather than doubt, not because awareness is missing, but because belief is stronger than concern. They believe people are not fixed in their current behavior. They believe pain shapes actions. They believe inconsistency is temporary, not defining. And that belief becomes the filter through which everything is seen. Small disrespect becomes a misunderstanding. Broken promises become pressure from life. Emotional inconsistency becomes a phase, and every explanation creates space for patience to grow. The issue is not a single moment, it is accumulation. One overlooked detail leads to another. One minimized feeling makes the next one easier to ignore. Slowly, the internal alarm that should have spoken louder becomes quieter each time it is dismissed. Empaths are not blind to red flags. They simply process them differently. They give meaning where others might give distance. They assign reasons where others might set boundaries. But emotional patterns do not stay static. What is excused once is more likely to be repeated. What is tolerated lightly begins to appear more frequently. And what once felt like a small inconsistency starts forming into something more persistent. Over time, these ignored signals do not disappear. They accumulate beneath the surface, quietly shaping emotional weight that is not fully recognized until it begins to feel heavy enough to notice without yet understanding where it all started from. Without noticing the shift, the role begins to change. It is not announced, it is not chosen consciously, it simply forms through repetition of emotional involvement that slowly becomes deeper than intended. Empaths start stepping into spaces that were never meant to be fully theirs. Conversations become emotional repairs. Problems turn into responsibilities. Silence becomes something they try to understand, fix, or soothe. Without realizing it, they begin absorbing more than they express. Stress from others starts blending into their own emotional space. Tension that belongs elsewhere starts feeling personal. Pain that was never theirs starts echoing internally as if it was. They become emotional caretakers in subtle ways. Always aware, always adjusting, always trying to maintain balance where imbalance already exists. Fixing problems becomes a pattern, not because they are asked to, but because they feel responsible when things fall apart. Carrying pain becomes normal because they have learned how to hold emotional weight without letting it show. And in that process, something shifts quietly in the background. The relationship stops feeling equal. Not suddenly, not clearly, but gradually. They are no longer simply participating in connection, they are maintaining it, supporting it, stabilizing it, holding it together during moments when it would otherwise fall apart. At first, this feels like care, like devotion, like emotional depth, but over time it begins to stretch beyond healthy limits, because one person starts becoming the container for emotional turbulence that belongs to two. The balance that once existed between giving and receiving starts to fade. Effort becomes uneven but normalized. Emotional labor becomes one-sided but justified through understanding. And eventually, without any clear breaking point, the weight they carry stops feeling like occasional support and starts feeling like constant responsibility, something that never truly leaves their hands long enough for them to breathe freely. Most people misread the ending. They see the absence and assume it appeared suddenly, as if one day everything was fine and the next day the empath simply vanished. But that is never how it unfolds. Leaving is not the beginning of the change. It is the final visible result of something that has been building quietly for a long time. Before distance ever happens, exhaustion settles in first, a kind of tiredness that sleep does not fix, a heaviness that exists even in silence, a mental fog created by holding too much for too long without equal emotional return. The crying often comes before clarity. Not loud or dramatic, but private moments of release where everything finally feels too full to hold in anymore. Not because love disappeared, but because holding on started to hurt more than letting go. Then comes overthinking. Endless internal conversations. Replaying words, reanalyzing moments, searching for meaning in things that no longer feel stable. The mind tries to make sense of emotional imbalance that the heart has already started to feel. And beneath all of it, silent burnout forms. Not visible, not announced, just a gradual fading of emotional energy that once felt endless. Conversations take more effort. Understanding feels heavier. Patience begins to feel stretched thin in ways that are hard to explain. Empaths rarely recognize this stage in real time. They continue showing up, continue understanding, continue giving what they always have. But something inside begins to slow down without permission. By the time leaving becomes visible from the outside, the inner departure has already been unfolding for much longer. Emotional detachment begins quietly, long before physical distance ever follows. And when the moment of walking away finally arrives, it is not the beginning of pain. It is often the end of a long period of silent endurance that most people never saw happening beneath the surface. It often arrives without warning, not as a breakdown, not as an emotional collapse, but as a quiet moment of awareness that changes everything from within. A simple thought appears, almost too soft to notice at first, yet impossible to ignore once it settles in. I keep understanding everyone, but who understands me? There is no dramatic shift in the world outside. Nothing visibly changes in that moment. But inside, something begins to reorganize itself. Long-held patterns of giving, explaining, and absorbing start to feel different under the weight of that question. Because for so long, understanding others felt natural, automatic, almost like a purpose. Their emotions, their struggles, their silence. Everything was processed, held, and carried with care. But this question turns that focus inward for the first time in a long time, and it does not demand an answer from anyone else. It simply creates space. Space that was never fully allowed before. Space where their own emotions start to surface without interruption. For the first time, attention shifts away from fixing, interpreting, or managing what others feel. And slowly, almost cautiously, it begins to rest on what has been quietly present all along. Unspoken exhaustion, unacknowledged needs, emotional weight that was always carried but rarely named. This shift is not loud. It does not create conflict. It does not demand attention. But it changes direction. Because once an empath starts noticing their own emotional world with the same depth they once reserved for others, something fundamental begins to transform. The internal balance no longer feels automatic, it starts to feel visible, questionable, and deeply personal in a way it never was before. This is where most misunderstandings begin. From the outside, people often search for a single moment, a clear incident, a breaking point that can be pointed at and labeled as the cause. But for empaths, that is rarely how it works. There is no dramatic final argument that changes everything. No single bad day that ends it all. No isolated disagreement that becomes the turning point. What actually builds the line is repetition. Quiet repetition that slowly reshapes emotional tolerance over time. Repeated betrayal of trust. Repeated emotional neglect that goes unaddressed. Repeated disregard for feelings that were expressed clearly but not protected. Each moment on its own may seem small, manageable, even forgivable in isolation, but together they create something different. A pattern that begins to speak louder than intention ever can. Empaths do not leave because of one mistake. They leave because mistakes begin to form a language of their own. A language that communicates inconsistency, emotional carelessness, and lack of awareness without needing words. Patterns carry more weight than explanations, because explanations can change in the moment, but patterns reveal what remains unchanged over time. At first, empathy fills the gaps, understanding softens the impact, patience extends the timeline, but patterns do not disappear simply because they are understood. They continue repeating until understanding starts to lose its protective effect. And somewhere in that repetition, emotional clarity begins to form. Not as anger, not as reaction, but as recognition. A quiet realization that effort is not being matched and awareness is not turning into change. This is where emotional distance begins to grow internally long before any physical separation takes place. Not as a decision made in frustration, but as a conclusion shaped slowly through experience that keeps repeating itself in the same emotional direction. This moment does not arrive with noise. It does not announce itself. It simply settles in quietly after a long period of emotional confusion and inner conflict. Empaths often forgive first with their mind. They rationalize. They understand context. They build explanations that allow space for compassion, even when things feel unstable. The mind works hard to preserve connection, to preserve meaning, to preserve hope. But the heart moves at a different pace. It takes longer to process emotional truth, longer to absorb patterns, longer to accept what the mind has already been trying to understand for some time. And then something shifts. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but unmistakably. The same excuses that once created comfort start to feel empty. Words that once softened pain no longer reach the same place. Emotional reassurance begins to lose its effect. Hope, which once felt natural, starts to feel heavy instead of uplifting. It no longer brings peace, it brings effort. A sense of trying to hold something together that no longer responds the same way. The emotional connection does not disappear instantly. It fades in strength, in responsiveness, in warmth that no longer flows as easily as it once did. And deep inside, beneath all the reasoning and reflection, something quiet becomes clear. There is no longer the same sense of emotional alignment. No longer the same internal pull toward repair. No longer the same belief that things will naturally return to what they once were. It is not anger that forms this realization. It is clarity. A calm, undeniable awareness that something fundamental has already shifted beyond return. And once the heart reaches this understanding, the emotional bond does not break loudly. It simply stops renewing itself in the same way it once did, marking the beginning of a separation that was felt long before it was ever seen. This stage is often misunderstood more than any other. From the outside, it can even look like peace, like stability has returned, like emotional tension has finally settled. The empath becomes noticeably quieter, not because they suddenly feel lighter, but because something inside them has shifted in how they engage with emotional effort. They respond less, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion that no longer needs expression. They react less, not because they no longer feel, but because feeling everything deeply no longer leads to change. They stop entering emotional battles they once tried so hard to resolve. Conversations that used to matter deeply no longer feel worth the internal cost. To others, this can appear as improvement, a calmer presence, fewer conflicts, less emotional intensity. It can be mistaken for healing, but underneath that appearance, something very different is happening. The need to explain themselves begins to fade. Not because they lack words, but because words no longer feel effective in places where understanding has not translated into change. The effort to be understood starts dissolving quietly, not in protest, not in frustration, but in acceptance that constant explanation does not always lead to emotional alignment. So instead of pushing for clarity, they withdraw from unnecessary emotional engagement. They conserve energy that was once spent trying to bridge gaps that kept reopening. What people often miss is that this silence is not new connection forming. It is reduced participation in emotional imbalance. The empath is still aware, still thoughtful, still present in observation. But the internal drive to fix, clarify, or repair every emotional disconnect begins to weaken. And in that shift, something important becomes clear without being spoken. They are no longer trying to convince anyone of their feelings because they have already started prioritizing the emotional truth they now carry within themselves. Detachment rarely looks like an ending at first. There is no clear signal, no visible shift that tells others the process has already begun. From the outside, everything may still appear intact, even steady, but internally, something fundamental starts to change in how the empath connects. Emotional investment begins to loosen. Not abruptly, but gradually, like something slowly releasing its grip after holding on for too long. They are still present in conversations, still responding, still engaging when needed, but the emotional depth behind those interactions begins to shift. The same words no longer carry the same weight internally. The same moments no longer create the same emotional response. This is where the exit quietly begins. Not as action, but as separation in layers. Emotionally first, they start stepping back from deep involvement. The emotional intensity that once defined the connection begins to fade. They no longer absorb everything as personally. Mentally second, they start seeing the pattern more clearly without the emotional filter that once softened it. They observe instead of internalize. They understand instead of attach. Physically last, distance becomes visible, less communication, less effort to initiate, less need to remain constantly engaged in something that no longer feels emotionally reciprocal. What makes this stage difficult for others to recognize is that nothing dramatic happens. There is no confrontation that signals the end. No single moment that defines the separation. Instead, it feels like gradual disappearance while still being present. A slow withdrawal that is already complete on the inside long before it becomes visible on the outside. And by the time the empath finally walks away, the emotional departure has already been lived through in silence, grieved in private, processed in layers that no one else saw unfolding. So the physical exit does not mark the beginning of loss. It marks the final confirmation of a separation that was already completed long before it ever became visible. When the moment of departure finally arrives, it is rarely loud or dramatic. There is no desire to create pain in return, no intention to make anyone understand through suffering, no hidden need for punishment or emotional retaliation. It is something much quieter than that, much more internal, much more final in its own way. They are not leaving to prove a point. They are leaving because something inside them has reached its limit. A point where continued presence no longer feels like connection, but like erosion of self. Empaths do not choose distance lightly. They understand attachment deeply. They understand history, emotion, and shared moments that cannot simply be erased. But they also understand something else with growing clarity over time. Survival matters more than endurance. And when staying begins to feel like losing pieces of themselves repeatedly, the meaning of connection starts to change. It is no longer about love alone. It becomes about emotional cost. There comes a moment where everything becomes clear in a way that does not require further discussion. No more internal negotiation. No more emotional justification, just awareness that continuing in the same environment would slowly diminish what remains of their inner stability. At that point, peace stops being an abstract idea. It becomes a necessity, something more important than maintaining attachment that no longer supports emotional well-being. And once that realization settles in fully, something shifts permanently in how they relate to the situation. The connection is no longer something they try to repair or revisit. It becomes something they step away from with quiet certainty. Not out of anger, not out of rejection, but out of self-preservation that no longer allows room for emotional cycles that cause harm. And after crossing that internal threshold, the idea of returning no longer feels natural. Because what once felt like home has already been mentally and emotionally left behind long before the final goodbye was ever spoken. Empaths do not disappear because their care runs out. They disappear because the weight of caring without balance slowly becomes too heavy to carry. The people with the deepest hearts are often the ones who stay the longest. They understand more, they forgive more, they try more. They give more chances than most would ever consider. But even the strongest emotional capacity has a quiet limit. Not a limit of love, but a limit of self-sacrifice. And there comes a moment when clarity finally arrives with calm certainty. Love was never meant to feel like self-destruction. Connection was never meant to erase the person giving it. And maybe the final turning point is not betrayal itself, not conflict, not disappointment. Maybe it is the quiet realization that staying no longer honors their own emotional truth, that something within them deserves the same care they have always given to others. Because once an empath chooses peace over pain, the change is not just external, it is deeply internal. They do not simply walk away from people. They walk back toward themselves, toward balance, toward emotional honesty, toward a version of life where their presence is no longer paid for with their own well-being. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more content like this. Your support helps this space grow. And as you move forward, remember this: the strongest hearts are not the ones that survive endless pain. They are the ones that finally learn they were never meant to live inside it.